right, David, welcome to another episode of Reverse CSI. It's amazing. The marginal propensity to consume time is always seemingly equal to the amount of time that we have. And I always seem to wind up vamping for just a few seconds at the start of the show. How are you today, David?
I'm well, Jason. It's good to be with you.
Good to be with you as always. I'm working on the last seconds here of getting everything prepared for our show today. This is actually another really remarkable episode because, you know, David, one of the things that's always fascinated me about your research is it falls into this category where I think a lot of people at first blush think the things that you say are outrageous and potentially conspiracy theories, as some might say. Of course, I can't see what that says. But I disagree. I think you are onto some incredible revelations, and the information that you're going to share today really serves to bolster some of the things that you've been saying for many months, and frankly, years. I've known you for some time now, and there we go. We've got you on your video feed, and we've created a photo collage today. I like it that we've gotten into this mode of making these very sort of story-driven photo collages that people can use to follow along, because today you're going to describe for us a virtual reality sports book that at once seemed fanciful, but it's possible that Serco, the company that you've spoken about so many times and in so many varieties of criminal involvement that they may have, you've recently introduced the chairman of Serco, a person a lot of people might not be familiar with, this guy, Roy Gardner. And another part of what you and I do that's so interesting is that sometimes you introduce ideas and then we participate together in researching and discovering these things. And it seems that Roy Gardner is already involved in virtual reality sports books. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, totally. He's a director of William Hill. William Hill, as I understand, around the mid-1950s or 60s, was the largest bookmaker in the world. And William Hill has muscled its way into Nevada, apparently with these virtual reality sportsbook. And virtual reality sportsbook allows you to bet on a hypothetical, magical, unreal game. Presumably the algorithms are set up in a way that don't favor the house, although that's pretty unlikely, given Charles McNeil's complaint in 1950 that he was getting out of what he invented, which was spread betting and sport books, because the mob wanted to share his brain. Right? No, partner with his brain.
Right, but let me back you up there, because that guy, Charles McNeil, he's pretty important. I don't know if everybody remembers, Charles McNeil was John F. Kennedy's math professor, wasn't he?
Maths teacher at his grade school, but he was, his alma mater was, or is, the University of Chicago, where our friend Barack Hussein Obama or Barry Soetoro waxed forth on, you know, how to bring down American industry, and even lectured on such. Over there in the collage on the left, you got that extraordinary going. But let me just take a riff of where I was in 1964 to give a bit of context here. I was in Dallas on a kind of university holiday, driving a Plymouth, I think, no, maybe it was a Chevrolet Impala that used as much oil as it did gas, so it was pretty destructive. But anyway, I happened to have my hair cut by Jack Ruby's barber, right? So that's 1964. I'm 23, I guess. No, yes, no, 21. So I said to this guy, so what do you think, what do the people think in Dallas about the assassination of your president? And he said, everyone knows in Dallas there were multiple snipers, right? I didn't heard of Charles McNeil right then. But as you point out, Charles McNeil was his JFK's mathematics teacher at the grade school. He got out of that, and eventually he started a bookmaker business in Chicago, made a lot of money. But he's the pioneer or the inventor of spread betting, where you actually bet on the accuracy of a goal difference or a score difference, as opposed to who's going to win or lose. And for a long time, as I think you know, I've been puzzling about JFK and that fatal trip across Dealey Plaza, where I think I see 3 bullets, particularly the last bullet, that jerked JFK's head backwards and blew a 6-square-inch fragment out of the back of his head. And I thought, wouldn't that be interesting if we started analyzing crimes, particularly in where the money comes from to pay them, in terms of the point of view of a sports bookmaker, right? That is to say, you're taking bets on the body counts or the times of death. So if we go to, for example, your collage, again, I think this is just an extraordinary image, an enormous amount of information that I believe or hope that will help people understand what we're talking about. Because let me go sideways here. I hate this term conspiracy theorist. I'm an engineer, right? And I'm proud of it. I'm a very good engineer. I got a first-class degree in spite of what Agent Serco prattles on about with his tattooed stupidities. Right, I got a first-class degree in engineering from Cambridge University, and I was at Queen's College. And I'm able to think reasonably and rationally. I've invented a number of devices, including the deductive computing machine. I've applied to the patent office, etc., etc. I don't want to bore people with that. But when I start looking at any kind of crime, the fact that the 2 towers are brought down in the same day in their own footprint with under free fall gravity, and start asking questions, I think you and I and like-minded logical people, to be dismissed or categorized as conspiracy theorists, it's libelous, it's defamatory, and it's stupid. Yeah. Because if you dismiss every theory, including the first theory put out by the government, that Osama bin Laden was responsible for this, then you can't begin your investigation, which makes a mockery of a crime scene investigation. I don't know if maybe I'm getting a little excited there, but I think you are under pressure by idiots all the time, trying to divert us and distract us from analyzing a major crime, which represents, because we haven't found the solution, an existential threat to the United States of America. And in case these clowns don't know what existential means, it means a threat to the very survival of the Republic. Over to you.
No, I agree with you, David, and that's the simplest possible thing that someone can say to be dismissive. It really, I agree, it is idiotic and often just stupid, but it's really important, David, that people who are watching us right now join us for the second portion of today's show on patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards and patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth or subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. And before we get into the meat of the presentation today, I also want to remind people that they can visit your totally free website. That, of course, is reversecsiscripts.com. You have been maintaining the playlist of all of our YouTube videos on there, so people who want to follow on YouTube can do that. Everyone can also follow you on Twitter. You are at CSI Hawkins on Twitter. And in addition to the weekly videos that David and I do on Fridays, he's got almost daily blog posts, and people can keep up with everything that David is doing. Now, let's talk for a minute about this guy, Charles McNeil. He invented spread betting. He said that the mob wanted to get involved, or rather partner with his brain. We've heard a lot about mafia involvement with unions, and you've spoken to us about cities and guilds, which is essentially the same thing as a union, right? A guild, and how these organizations have exerted influence over various events. And really what we're saying is this virtual reality sports book, which you had speculated about, and just in conversation yesterday while you and I were talking, we found this thing, which is an article on it's a website, virtualrealitysportsbook.com, and you've been speaking to me about this company. Is it called William Hill?
Yes, William Hill. It's an old, established British bookmaker, probably one of the biggest in the world now. And I think they pioneered virtual reality storyboards
Sports books.
And betting, sport books.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
They have
And,
it. This article
and
tells us they already have a virtual reality sports book. And of course, David, you are a pioneer in artificial intelligence, and I am a pioneer in virtual reality. The first virtual reality production that I did with my 3D production company was in 1993. I've invented virtual reality cameras. We've shown a demonstration of a virtual reality production that I did. And the thing that sort of hit me like a lightning bolt when you brought this out is that so many people like to dismiss many of the topics that you and I discuss, but yet it seems to me every week you are bringing forward more and more evidence that actually supports your theories. And the thing that's so amazing about a virtual reality sportsbook is that when someone puts on this virtual reality headset, they are presented with imagery and sound, an immersive environment that can be three-dimensional, that can actually make you feel like you're there. This is actually a sort of portable, self-contained version of the electronic visualization lab at the University of Illinois in Chicago. What they created in the 1990s that occupied an entire room can now be contained in a lightweight headset like this. So conceivably, anyone could be involved in an invisible sportsbook gambling scenario that could span the world. The players don't need to be in the same location as long as they have a high-speed network connection, which today, of course, would be fiber optic.
And absolutely, and that would be available through the Northwestern University IT Partnerships Network, which hooks up the Russian Federation and China to the University of Illinois in Chicago, where Bill Ayers, the criminal terrorist leader of the Weather Underground, together with his wife, Bernadine Dawn, so they can squat into the electronic visualization laboratory, which I think can handle 50 people, and they could engage, yet to be proven, in sportsbook betting on the body counts on 911 as the two World Trade Center towers are brought down. This to me is astonishing. And sorry?
Or any event, certainly including
any event, any mass casualty event, or even a high-value target event, which quite often the mob out of London and Chicago, they like to embed a high-value target event within a mass casualty event, because then no one realizes who the real target is. So if you've got a high-value target on a Boeing 737 MAX 8 aircraft and 120 other passengers, they're just collateral. And you can buy insurance, right, on the hull or whatever it is before the crash, and basically you can double your money, you can get cat bonds, etc. So it's a nightmare to trace the money through these kind of complex networks. Can we just zoom in on that bottom left schematic that's up on the wall beside Obama, just to the left of Obama? Yeah, zoom in there, and let's talk about this virtual reality Deadpool sportsbook concept. Now, what happened is the British company Standard Telephone and Cables spun off, I think, a research lab from ITT, which incidentally had a headquarters office in the building number 7 on 911, and it proceeded to develop some amazing technology, including fiber optics and pulse code modulation. And apparently today, a single 100 million simultaneous telephone conversations. So that's quite a lot of chatter, right?
Yes.
So what happens with these fiber optic cables is the majority of the strands are what is known as dark, right? And they can be available to be leased to organized crime groups.
Let's just clarify for a second, David, by dark, because the fiber optic cable literally transmits light, which is part of the reason why it can be so fast. And if it's pulsing light, you know, the presence of light versus the absence of light becomes a binary signal, and they can just send so much information over it. So when a fiber optic cable is transmitting data, there literally is light traveling through it, and when there isn't, it's actually dark.
Absolutely. And so when it switches from dark to light, well, the normal terminology, you have lit fiber and dark fiber. And it suddenly struck me like, a blow on the head, basically. What happens if you lease dark fiber to organized crime groups in Chicago and London and Shanghai and wherever in the world, and they have an opportunity when it occurs for someone, and I'm not saying Mr. Swigart did it, but remember, Swigart's skills or professional background include describing himself as an ethical hacker, right, and checking for vulnerabilities in people's networks, and presumably, if he's truly ethical, advising the ethical client, look, you've got a back door here, you better close it. Now, there is no guarantee, and I'm not an expert at this, that Swigart is as smart as he seems to think he is. What happens if he's not a very good ethical hacker and he leaves a back door open and someone comes in behind him and revokes the certificate of the good guys at the Mandalay Bay Hotel? So let's say, hypothetically, there was an exercise going on for hotel security in Mandalay on 1st of October 2017. And there's a bunch of people, I don't know, FBI, hotel security, Las Vegas police, etc., swanning around communicating on the public key infrastructure that, unfortunately for the United States, was invented at GCHQ by the British. Much of that technology, I believe, very early on was shared with the National Security Agency, but the British did not want, or the British intelligence didn't want to alert the world that they were actually in a de facto partnership with the National Security Agency. Now, National Security Agency, unfortunately for its reputation, I think, will prove to have allowed an extraordinarily talented and dangerous spy into its midst by the name of Maureen Baginski. And Maureen Baginski, after leaving the National Security Agency, went on, and in 2003 to 2005, unfortunately for Mr. Mueller, invented or developed or implemented an intelligence network for the FBI. And I ask, I'm not an American, but didn't the FBI have an intelligence network before 2003? So wouldn't it be interesting if Maureen Baginski actually implemented a fiber optic link within the FBI, which could launch, provided the FBI was stood down, a man-in-the-middle attack right in the middle of, I don't know, 911, or the Pulse nightclub, or the Sandy Hook shooting, etc., or the Deepwater Horizon, which I'm absolutely convinced as an expert in this area, was sabotage and that blow up. So going back to the map, the schematic over on the left, perhaps we could just zoom in on that again. I'll pick out some of the high points and suggest to the listeners how you could set up a fiber optic Deadpool sportsbook in virtual reality and create the impression that the United States is under attack by a guy in a cave in Afghanistan, while in fact it is under attack by domestic and foreign traitors and organized crime groups. So you see the terminology there is a landing point, a subsea landing point. There's a box just by that little pool of water. And then you have a blue and a red fiber coming out of that box. The red fiber is short haul fiber, and that runs around, effectively, you could say, a campus, right? So let's say that it was coming into the Winter Garden in New York on 911, and you had short haul fiber running into the World Trade Center buildings and up to the various floors that might participate through a network of ignition and detonation with the munitions or Special Operation Forces demolition kit needed to bring the buildings down. The blue fiber is the long haul fiber, right? And that can go over subsea over to the United Kingdom. Now, again, unfortunately, in one sense, I mean, it's a great and extraordinary compliment to British technology, but they've now got to the stage where the cesium fountain clock invented at the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington, the most accurate clock in the world, is not hardwired is the wrong term, but you can now run fiber directly into or beside that clock. And the National Physical Laboratory is providing what they call time over fiber service. which is exactly what is needed for a virtual reality death pool sports book where people
for
betting
any
on the time.
critical application where timing is critical, right? Like we're talking micro milliseconds, right?
Yes, I mean, this clock is accurate to 1 second, I think, in 186 million years, which will see you and me out. But our listeners should understand, right? With a sports book, a global sports book, you could have Bill Clinton in a hotel in Queensland, in Australia, right, betting in real time on when the Pentagon is going to be hit on the morning of 9/11. If he did that, right, then it might very well show on the algorithmic or the computer records the date of September the 12th, 2001, because when the Pentagon was hit in the States, it was September the 12th across the date line in Queensland, Australia, where Bill Clinton was hanging out. So he ends up with a nearly perfect alibi, but potentially he could be participating in sportsbook betting on the death pool of 9/11. That's pretty shocking, or it should be, right?
Yeah.
Because I think he was. And if he wasn't betting, he was watching, like some pervert clown, etc., etc. So going back to the schematic, let's just have a look at that schematic again.
Sure.
If you can zoom in.
Have you got it?
Now, as you go around with the red and the blue fiber optics, right, you come to a point where it says, I think, Allied Fiber Cell Tower and Collector. What that means is, let's say we bring up this co-location.
Yeah.
So that means the red and the blue team could bleed into each other, as a red and the blue fiber could be bleeding into each other. So let's say you switch on the dark fiber and it becomes red active fiber for the duration of the criminal enterprise, which might be a death pool or a dead pool, where you're going to be betting on the times of death or the body counts for 343 firefighters. I mean, do people really think that we're that stupid? The firefighters' Motorola Solutions radios were jammed, right? And when tower number 2, which had been hit after tower number 1, collapsed and killed all the firefighters inside that building, what should have happened is that the fire chief should have instructed the firefighters in tower 1, get the hell out of there. I mean, I did firefighting in the oil industry. And you're very, I'm not saying that I'm particularly competent, because I tend to panic under pressure, but these are trained, capable people, and they were killed. This was mass murder. It wasn't a tragedy. It wasn't an accident, right? This was mass murder. They jammed the Motorola radios using these fiber optics in. So Mr. Swigart, for example, swanning around as an ethical hacker, he would be an expert at arranging for the revocation of certificates of the blue team defenders of American interest or the public in Washington or in New York. So now, to what extent does that make him culpable? I'm not interested in crime at this stage, in guilt or innocence. What I am interested in, and I believe is the remedy for bringing this show to a grinding halt, is the bringing an action for wrongful death as a result of the negligent, reckless, willful, or fraudulent use of patented devices by people who may be overwhelmed. If they're negligent, so be it, right? We're not accusing them of a crime. And I'm quite sure that looking at Mr. Swigart, he could be extremely negligent. He could be extremely reckless. He could be extremely willful. As to whether he's a fraud, well, let the chips fall where they may. The point is, by going to Nortel, for example, which bought the standard telephone and cables patent pool for fiber optics, Nortel came up with a patent for revocation of certificates. That is to say, on the fly, in the middle of an exercise, a continuity of government exercise, you could revoke the certificates of the blue team defenders during the exercise, switch the red team from foe to friend, and fly the weapon into the Pentagon's U.S. Navy Command Center and kill Captain Gerald DeConto, the duty officer of the Pentagon's U.S. Navy Command Center on 9/11, and 126 of his colleagues. And Mr. Mueller and Maureen Baginski and all these other scumbags, they have not investigated that crime. They've deployed, I think through Serco, these social engineers to take people like you and myself and our colleagues and friends around the world away from the crime scene investigation So they control the outcome of the crime scene investigation, and there is no outcome, meaning the enemy is emboldened. It's now better equipped, right? It's got more technology. For example, Serco is in a joint venture with Lockheed Martin at the atomic weapons establishment in the United Kingdom. So they're actually manufacturing, deploying, destroying, transporting, and storing atomic weapons. And they could have used them on 911. Over to you, Jason.
Yeah, there's a couple things I want to go over, David, because you've introduced a lot of topics. I don't know if we have shared with people or if people have seen these photos of Robert Mueller testifying, I believe, before Congress with Maureen Baginski. Maureen Baginski, as you've pointed out, was the, she worked with NSA and then later FBI to develop some sort of intelligence unit within the FBI. She has infamously said that 9/11 was a gift to the NSA. So, this is a crazy person in my view. Anyone who would say that 9/11 was a gift has got a screw loose or something. And the other thing that I wanted to bring to everyone's attention with regard to Motorola radios, this is something that had been touched on, I think, by Laura Loomer, that Sheriff Joe Lombardo had made a switch to a sophisticated type of Motorola radio that was in use on October 1st, 2017. I think there were some questions about those Motorola radios in Las Vegas and what role they may have played with regard to the LVMPD's readiness during that massacre that took place. I also want to clarify for our viewers, because some people who've been in the chat are potentially misunderstanding the meaning of today's title. When we talk about Stephen Paddock's Las Vegas shooting, we certainly agree that Mr. Paddock very likely did not do any shooting. Stephen Paddock's Las Vegas shooting is somebody walking in the door of his hotel room, shooting him in the head and leaving him on the floor. This is why we've positioned him in the victim's tunnel. We believe that Stephen Paddock was the first victim on October 1st, 2017, and that the story that we've all heard in the national news is exactly a fake news inject, what Serco and others might call a media play. Isn't that right, David?
Yes, Serco provides a service at Hawk Hills, which is a mansion well established with the Ministry of Defense in the United Kingdom, to the United Kingdom Cabinet Office and government clients around the world. And it calls it resilience or emergency training. And the extraordinary thing is the client is expected to lend its communication network to Serco, where Serco can inject news or media plays to create a virtual reality for the client, and then groom and train the spokespersons for the government client so that they don't alarm the public. Well, that's pretty stupid when you think about it, because the public should be alarmed if there is a secret criminal organization embedded within their government that is faking a news story, and through, let's say, Mr. Swigert or the people in his boot camp where they're being trained how to revoke certificates, suddenly in the middle of the exercise, the good guys' certificates, which will allow them to communicate with each other and synchronize their defense, goes dark, right? And they can't communicate. That opens up the opportunity, I think, for the sports betting to begin. Because now the red team, reporting directly to the criminal organizer. Now, am I saying that Roy Gardner is a criminal organizer? I don't know. But he's sitting on top of the world's biggest company you've never heard of. If you Google that, you'll find that has somehow weaseled its way into the United States government and now runs, this is a British outsourcer company. It runs the American Defense Ammunition Center, which tracks every piece of ammunition around the world. It runs the National Visa Center, where they brought in the bin Laden sleeper cells to give the impression or the illusion that this guy in a cave in Afghanistan could position the skill sets around the target zones or killing sites in New York and Washington. It runs the United States Patent and Trademark Office. And on November the 17th last year, it proudly announced we have processed, using artificial intelligence, the 4 millionth patent for the United States Patent and Trademark Office, which recently celebrated its 10 millionth patent. And I think you and I were both quite amazed, because what was shown for the 10 millionth patent, this was, I think, in the Oval Room of the White House with Mr. Slightly out of it, way past sell date, Wilbur Ross, was sitting there with the President Trump, holding up the patent certificate for the 10 millionth patent. And the particular patent that was selected for the 10 millionth patent was won by Raytheon for laser 3D images through remote sensors. And the particular example of what this could do was Ground Zero after 9/11, which is a scene of devastation that looks like a
let's be
nuclear
clear.
bomb.
The example that they gave was creating some sort of relief map, not that they were proudly showing that they had created that incident. They made a map of Ground Zero.
Yes, with that patented device.
Yeah.
But I thought that's interesting, because when Serco, I believe right now, every listener, every American citizen should demand of their elected representatives that Serco is stripped out of every government office in the United States. It is not safe. It runs the back office of the Obamacare operation. That was a $1.2 billion contract. It runs the United States Patent and Trademark Office. It runs the National Visa Center, the United States Defense Ammunition Center, and about 60 FAA contract towers on 911, which could have been providing the telemetry that guided the weapons platforms. Forget whether it's a Boeing 737 or whatever. Something came across the Pentagon lawn at 500 miles an hour, 15 feet elevation, and tunneled through the Pentagon, through 8 walls of the Pentagon, into the inner courtyard. And you don't have to be an engineer to recognize that that could not be done by an aluminum-hulled Boeing civilian aircraft. It had to be a bunker buster missile.
Right.
So America,
let me keep you on Roy Gardner for a second, David, because I don't mean to interrupt, but I think people are really intrigued by this new notion that you've introduced today, this virtual reality sports book, and the concept that it could be. So here's one part that I wanted to add, because it seems to me that, you and I were having this conversation last night where maybe people know this, maybe they don't, but in the 1950s in the United States, the general public had no knowledge of Cosa Nostra, the Italian mafia organized crime. And in fact, J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI actively denied the existence of it until this incident in upstate New York called the Appalachian Meeting, where local police stumbled upon a large organized crime meeting, arrested a number of members of organized crime families, and the FBI was forced to acknowledge the existence of the mafia. Then we've got The Godfather, The Sopranos. Everybody knows about it now. Everybody knows that the mafia exists. So it's, I think, a reasonable assumption to say that there are things that people who are in the highest echelons of criminal underground networks are aware of that the general public is not. So what if one of those things is that when you're planning a mass casualty event, one of the ways you can profit from it is by having this type of death pool betting. Now, you've already established for us that White's Club in London is a hundreds of years old, extremely exclusive club that only is available to members of the economic and intellectual elite, such as the Soames brothers and the guy who invented the prisoner tracking GPS bracelet, and that these guys are historically have a long record of betting on death. Now, the thing that is remarkable is that you've spoken to us about this guy, Roy Gardner, and I know we introduce a lot of names in some of these videos, so I just want to go over this for everyone again. Roy Gardner, if I'm understanding correctly, David, he's on the board of directors for Serco, correct?
He's the chairman of Serco. He is the director of Willis Holdings. Now, that's very important because Willis Holdings is an insurance broker. I think they changed the name of the Sears Tower to Willis Tower in Chicago. And Willis Faber was the insurance broker or syndicate that insured the Titanic.
But before we go to that, these are also remarkable coincidences that he's on the board of all these different companies. The one that insured the Titanic, etc. We also have this press release from William Hill, the leader in sportsbook betting, which says Sir Roy Gardner joins the William Hill board of directors. This was in February of 2014. So we know that William Hill has these virtual reality sportsbook betting rooms, which frankly, when you look at something like StarNet Communications, which was a physical operation that was engaging in hardcore and child pornography and online gaming, there's no telling what kind of absurd things those guys got into, but eventually it was rolled up by authorities, US authorities, came into Canada, took all the gear, arrested all those guys. Remarkably, the principal...
Excuse me, Jason, they didn't arrest anyone.
There we go, right.
They just took the kit.
Yeah,
right.
So they didn't arrest, but they should have, because they were doing illegal gambling and illegal pornography. The point I'm getting at is maybe the people who were running that said, boy, why do we want a physical location in a country where we could be arrested when we could have this virtual reality thing that could exist on the dark net, could be delivered over dirty fiber to whoever wants to use it, and in an instant, you could delete the whole thing and nobody knows that it ever existed.
Exactly. There's no paper trail, right? So you have the lit fiber. It's not necessarily the good fiber. The lit fiber, where clients are using the services of people like David Swigart to test for vulnerabilities, and then you have the dark fiber, where I believe criminal organizations might use David Swigart or his equivalent for criminal possibilities or investment opportunities. Because when you switch the dark to light, I believe what's happening with these death pools is you only switch the dark fiber to lit fiber when security has been stood down because its certificates have been trivial. So on 911, it is quite conceivable for a criminal organization in London, in the city of London, right, to send a message over lit fiber which turns off the communications or public key infrastructure required by those three elements. If you zoom in on your collage, you very carefully, we discussed that, positioned the foot of Mr. Swigart with his wizard hat, right? And the foot of Mr. Swigart is placed on various components of the Federal Bridge Certification Authority, including, and in particular, the state of Illinois, it's a little difficult to see, the Department of Justice, and Veterans Affairs. Well, I don't know how many millions of vets there are, dotted around the United States. Many of them, they've come out of the military, they've gone into businesses and they're successful. A lot of the military, however, will have come out perhaps damaged with PTSD or scarred, or they can't find a job, but they've been taught in the military how to kill.
Don't we know somebody with PTSD in Poland who has no job, apparently?
Well, absolutely. This guy, Kevin Marsden, the tattooed slab, or whatever it was. And that's very interesting, but I won't digress too much. He's in a very elegantly equipped library, it would appear. He's always waving around these, what looks to me, or could be, first edition books. He seems to be challenged by people who he thinks might have a better education than he does. But anyway, I don't want to go there. But what intrigues me is if the worshipful company of stationers and newspaper makers, which is one of the 110 members of the City and Guilds of London, decided that it wanted to inject fake news or distract people engaged in investigations of major crimes with lawsuits and stuff like that, why wouldn't they hire a guy like that? He's obviously challenged, right? He's got a medical condition. He's always quoting this guy Swigart, and was it the Leopard Miroz? I don't understand that kind of network of losers.
Well, it's a social engineering network. Let's talk about it for a second, because it's important. What they've done is David Swigart obviously has a beyond cursory understanding of the law. He knows enough about it that he can defy it, and he can do certain things like hide his face, destroy evidence, do things in such a way that it becomes difficult to submit evidence in civil matters. And he's using this network of operatives to distribute the behavior over lots of different people, some of which aren't even within the United States, so that they can defy the reach of civil and even criminal courts. It's quite clever.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that comes back to the service offered by Serco at Hawk Hills to the UK Ministry of Defence and British intelligence by extension, where they inject news and media plays on their clients' networks, right, in order to groom and teach and train government workers or public spokespersons on how to respond to an attack. Well, I can't think of any more inappropriate way of responding to the attack of 9/11 than standing down the United States Air Force or sending its fighters over the Atlantic and away from the action. Field McConnell, my former associate at Able Danger, he said, but he's got vast experience, he would have switched off the communications that's telling him to go over the Atlantic, and he would go to the hotspots, even if he wasn't equipped with all the radar. You know, so obviously the strategic targets for any attempt to overthrow the government of the United States are in places like New York and Washington. So someone of his experience, but of course someone with less experience, they tend to do what they're told over the communication system. You hack your way into the communication system, which of course is superbly easy for Serco because it runs 60 FAA contract towers on 911. So it could have been handing off the allegedly hijacked aircraft by guys who could barely fly a Cessna, right, through the telemetry to the aircraft control computers and flying them as drones into their targets or dumping them in the Atlantic. So if we go back to, I think we should just stay with that schematic down on the left there, because I think we have limited time.
Yeah,
Jason.
We're actually just about out of time, David. And before we go into more on the schematic, I do want to remind everybody that we're going to be continuing the show at 1 p.m. Eastern. People can join us on patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards. That's David's Patreon site, and I hope that anybody who's watching us right now on YouTube or Periscope or Facebook or DLive or patreon.com/crowdsource the truth will also become a sponsor of David's. David and I work very hard throughout the week putting together these shows, doing all kinds of research and discovery on the fly. So please visit patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards and become a sponsor. Would also love it if people sponsor the channel by going to patreon.com/crowdsource the truth or subscribestar.com/crowdsource the truth. We'll be going into even more detail in just 17 minutes when we resume there. But David, what did you want to leave our viewers with regarding this schematic before we close out the show?
Okay, I just want to go through the wording, which I find interesting. The big block building, it uses the word carrier hotel, which I find interesting, because I think if a criminal organization did get hold of these dark fiber networks with the power to switch dark to dirty or through light, wouldn't it be interesting to do a deal with the worshipful company of innholders, which has a background going back to the 15th century and in modern terms has a reach into, let's say, the Marriott hotel chain with 1 million beds, and arrange for the elites, the financial or the intellectual elites, when they're checking into a hotel, they can have access to the dirty fiber, and they can place their bets on the time of death or the body counts at, let's say, the mosque in Christchurch in New Zealand, or the churches in Sri Lanka, or the Promenade des Anglais in Nice, where that truck drives down. And I get the impression that there are people watching from the safety. I mean, these are vermin of the first order, watching from the safety of their 4-star or 5-star hotels around the world and placing bets on a criminal and global organization headed by Serco that was previously called RCAGB 1929, Radio Corporation of America, Great Britain, 1929, that had the contract for providing British citizens with a 4-minute warning of a nuclear attack. And in 1988, morphed and guided by N.M. Rothschild and Son, turned itself through an IPO into a shareholder-owned company called Serco, where amongst the shareholders are 10 global custodians with $100 trillion of assets under management, the 2 elite teachers pension fund in the UK and the US, and the government of Saudi Arabia. I rest my case.
And Saudi Arabia was critically involved in the shooting in Las Vegas on October 1st, as been pointed out extensively by John Cullen and others. So, I mean, again, we're not saying that Serco planned this or that Serco, was critically involved in the Las Vegas shooting. What we're saying is it seems very possible that something like a virtual reality sportsbook could easily be set up for any of these mass casualty events. There's a long-established history of betting, death pool betting through this White's Club. And again, we're not suggesting that White's Club is doing this, but they've set the example. Why couldn't somebody else take it? So with that, David, we're going to wrap out the show for right now. People can join us on patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. I hope that people will go to those pages now and become sponsors of David and Crowdsource the Truth. People can join us for our follow-up show, which will be beginning at 1 p.m. on Patreon and Subscribestar. We look forward to seeing everyone there. And I also want to remind people that they can follow David on Twitter. He is on Twitter at CSI Hawkins. And people can also go to David's webpage, which is Reverse CSI Scripts. Please join David there. It's totally free and filled with useful information. David, I'll see you in just a few minutes on Patreon and Subscribestar.
Thank you, Jason. Bye for now.
Thanks, everybody, for watching.